2017 of $462 million, which is different from the $25 million surplus reported at the end of 2017 for budget purposes. Financial statements are reported based on Canadian public sector accrual accounting standards, whereas the budget is reported on a modified cash basis to better align revenue or cash inflows with expenditures or cash outflows. The key difference between the two methods is that the accrual method also recognizes revenues and expenditures that are expected to be received or expended in a future reporting period. Also records capital expenditures as tangible capital assets and only recognizes as an expense the amortization of that capital asset. The accumulated surplus represents the net of all the city's accumulated assets and liabilities. It is comprised of the total of all tangible capital assets and reserves less future liabilities. The accumulated surplus essentially represents the value of the net assets available for future generations. The city's overall accumulated surplus increased by $457 million in 2017. Most of that increase is due to the annual operating surplus. Overall net debt has increased to $2.21 billion, but so has the value of the non-financial assets, which is primarily comprised of tangible capital assets such as roads, water and wastewater infrastructure, buildings, land, equipment, and all assets under construction. Non-financial assets increased by $843 million. I will provide additional details on each line item in the next few slides. The most significant financial assets are in the form of cash and equivalents, cash and investments. In 2017, the city continued to shift from long-term investments to cash and cash equivalents in order to align with the cash flow requirements of major capital projects, including the Confederation Line. The last item in this table represents the value of the net assets for Hydro Ottawa, which we report on our financial statements on an equity basis. The city received dividends from Hydro Ottawa in the amount of $21 million in 2017 related to results from the 2016 operations. We had an increase in accounts payable and accrued liabilities primarily from higher accrued expenditures related to Stage 1 and now Stage 2 of the light rail, and also increased payables related to tax remissions from appeals. The accrued liability also includes payroll decreases due to timing differences in scheduled pay accruals or unsettled collective agreements, other employee costs. Deferred revenue primarily includes the development charges collected but not yet spent on projects. In 2017, there was an increase in development charges applied to Confederation Line as funding from government reached its limit in 2017 per the agreed-to funding schedules. The next slides will provide additional details on the next two major items, employee future benefits and pensions and the net long-term debt. Employee future benefits represent benefits earned but not payable until future years based on actuarial assumptions and changes in legislation. It is only an estimate and may or may not reflect the actual amounts that could be paid in the future. The amount payable in the current year is budgeted for each year, and the amount shown here is the total estimated future benefits. The most significant changes were primarily related to post-retirement and post-employment benefits, which increased by $34 million, mainly due to an increase in long-term disability claims and an increase in post-retirement benefits primarily due to an aging workforce. These increases were partially offset by $7 million reduction in the liability for the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund, which was primarily due to better than expected investment returns. Our net long-term debt increased to $2.03 billion this year due to a debt issuance in 2017 of $432 million. As you recall, we issued debt that was planned for 2018 in 2017 to take advantage of lower interest rates. What is important to note is that debt is only used to fund capital, and although total net debt is increasing each year, so is the city's investment in assets while maintaining debt servicing within established targets. When you look at the debt level compared to the total cost of the city's gross assets, it represents 9.9% of those assets. Principal and interest payments represent 8% of the city's own source revenues, which is significantly below the provincial limit of 25%. Council has also established specific targets for debt whereby principal and interest payments for tax rate and supported debt are not to exceed combined target of 8.5% of the city's own source revenue, and in 2017 this percentage was at 5.95%. So the overall value of assets based on cost increased by $1.1 billion in 2017. The most significant construction projects contributing to the increase is Confederation Line Phase 1, $284 million, Confederation Line Phase 2, $226 million, roads, $182 million, water, wastewater infrastructure, $235 million. As you can see from the chart, water and wastewater infrastructure makes up 28% of the total tangible capital asset net book value.
question, Mr. Chair. And on slide number 7, Madam Deputy Treasurer, you talk about legacy pension and transit and COSF. What's that mean? Put your mic on.
There are two stranded pension plans. The members of this pension plan, COSF is a closed member pension plan in transit. Some are still active, but on the OMERS plan. This was closed many years ago, and the city continues to maintain these plans. So we don't report OMERS on the city's financial statements. These are the only two that we actually do manage, maintain, and report on our financial statements.
So there were, you said it was 10 in 2016 and now down to 3. How can you explain that to us?
So that's the total net value. So those are now showing a surplus of $3 million in total.
It's a change in 7.
The change? Sorry. Oh, okay. So it was the change in the COSF, the change in the liability of $7 million.
So I always ask the same question every year. It's about the unfunded liability. I mean, are we still contribute to the unfunded liability? Are we to the treasurer? Are we still? Well, if I don't ask you that question on a yearly basis, you're going to miss it. So might as well just ask you that.
We do contribute to unfunded liabilities. COSF, which stands for City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund. And we make, when required, under the pension legislation, we make contributions to that. And the same for the OC Transpo. They have a legacy pension plan that we still maintain. We would make contributions as required under the Pensions Act. But yes, we make contributions for sick leave, for vacation leave, and I think our total was somewhere around $50-some million that we've set aside to fund future employee liabilities. So it's built into your base budget every year, all the expenses, but many years ago, this council agreed that if we had surplus in any of those accounts that are built into the annual operating budget, we would contribute that to the reserve on an ongoing basis to make certain that this liability is offset to a certain extent by funds within the city's reserve accounts.
And do we still have contribution to the WSIB, or we have our own, like we fund our own when it comes to WSIB?
WSIB was one that we agreed we would not set aside money for because it is built into your annual budget every year. We are required to assess what the future liability would be for those who are on WSIB, but we don't set aside a reserve to pay for that into the future. Long-term disability, though, we do. But WSIB, we pay that every year, and we've adjusted your budget over the years. If you remember, a couple of years ago when we had the presumptive cancers, we increased the WSIB budget for fire significantly.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Treasurer.
Thank you, Councillor Alcantara. Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, on slide 6. What are the environmental liabilities? I didn't get that clearly from your presentation.
Those are the amounts that we have estimated based on actuarial estimates for active and inactive landfill sites and contaminated sites.
Okay, so that's something that we have to we evaluate this each year depending on what we find out, because I think from the later report today we might be dealing with that again.
We re-evaluate the estimates every year. We do a full re-estimate every 3 years to look at the remaining useful life of some of these sites, and then what the costs associated with closing them
for
the next 25 years.
We do have some funds. We do have just a reserve for those as well, do you not? Is this the net of the reserve, or does it include the reserve?
This is the gross amount.
And the second one on there is mortgage leases and others. That's just, isn't that, I recall from other years, that's the value of the leases and things we have that we pay out every year, but we have to show them in because they're a liability for future years in our estate, but I believe that's what it is.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's good for the leases, and then the mortgages are for the housing.
So that these are things we then I put in the budget every year to pay for what that is each year, because I've seen it in the budget.
Correct.
So it's not something that's going to come back to haunt us very much.
No.
It shouldn't anyway.
No, we put the money aside every year.
And the other question is on well, I think it's 10. Let me just find it. 9. The chart. I was surprised to see with all the roads we've got that it's only 15% of our asset. I know these are actually the value of them today, which means it depends on the condition of the roads and things, and that will bring the value of them down.
It's based on depreciation estimates. Roads are amortized on what? How many years? Do you know? Anyway, it's based on an amortization. It's not a reflection of the state of the roads. It's based on the amortization.
But it does give an indication of how old our roads are before they've been finished. I think it's the rest of it. I think it's an indicator. We all know we have problems with our roads. And I think that the percentage of the value of the assets, when we consider how many we have and how important they are, is actually quite low. And that's probably an indication of the need for doing more there. I don't know if the transportation people are here or not, but anyway. And the land that's fairly significant, the value of the land. I know it's a bit, we have our buildings and things, and I do know that we have some that I continue to work on selling for you, but this is lands that we actually need then. And the value of land's going up, so this must be going up then.
I can look it up to see if it went up.
It's rather a sizable amount.
But it represents the value of all the land that we own, yes.
Which is more than the value of our roads, which is quite interesting.
But land does not depreciate.
Well, land doesn't depreciate, it just goes up.
That's the difference.
Councillor, if I can just add something. This is the depreciated value, and it is based on the book value. So the land, when we buy it, gets entered in at the value we buy it, and it never changes after that. Whereas the road, you put the road on at what it costs you to construct it, and then you continue to depreciate it. So it will continue to go down over time. So these are historical cost values that have been depreciated. If this was a replacement value, if this was actually what this was worth if on the market today, this would be over $32 billion. But this is a historical book value that has been depreciated.
That means that the roads, if you rebuild a road or you repave it, you reevaluate that value at that time and depreciate it again?
If we built a new road, it would get added on there at the cost that we spent to build it. If we repave it, though, that's considered part of the normal life of it. It actually doesn't increase the value of it. It just allows it to extend to the life that we have established for that road, which in most cases is 15 years. So that 15 years assumes that you are going to have, I think, 2 repavings during that time period. So some capital works that we do actually don't increase your assets. Some of them do.
I think a road's life is more than 15 years, I hope. Anyway,
it depends on the type of road it is. Your residential versus your arterial versus your collector, they all have different lives.
You're talking about the road being kept in good condition after 15 years. We have roads that are over 100, 200 years old.
That's true, but at one point in time, we would have had to completely reconstruct it, and we would have put that value on of that reconstruction at that time and started to depreciate it again.
So some of the really old roads that have been reconstructed for 20, 30, 40, 50 years would be worth zero right now then?
There would be roads likely on our list that have zero value that are fully depreciated.
Okay, thank you. Just the accounting system, I realize that, but I think it's something we need to be aware of because people look at these and ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Welcome to
Just to follow up on the question, that the land did go up by $38 million from 2016. $38 million.
Councillor Wilkinson, maybe we can take that offline after, and we'll go to Councillor Eggline now, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that I heard during the presentation that you've assigned some asset value to assets arising out of stage 2 of LRT, and since we haven't really started building stage 2 in any significant way, just wondering where that money comes from, or where that value comes from.
So there is some work going on the maintenance facility.
Right.
There's also all the other work that gets capitalized. So the
Sorry, all the which, sorry?
work, the preliminary stage 2 work that gets capitalized.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Egli. So we can now move on to your presentation, Susan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While they're just getting it up, I'll just give a little bit of background. So we're engaged to issue an opinion on the financial statements to state whether we believe they're fairly stated in accordance with public sector accounting standards. We do have some procedures that remain until the financial statements are actually approved by Council. June 27th, I believe it's expected to be. The audit is ongoing. However, we present our results based on where we are today, and at this point in time, we do believe, based on what we found, that we will be issuing an unmodified, or what's called a clean audit opinion. So what we thought we would do is just at a high level, based on our plan, we were able to rely on controls as we expected. We relied on the IT general controls, payroll controls, purchases, payables, and payments, and on the entity level controls. And I'll just quickly run through the areas where we focused and the differences that we identified. So the first slide here is talking to 3 areas where we focus, which is around revenue recognition, contingent liabilities, and investments in financial instruments. We do substantive procedures where we actually look at the revenue that's been recognized in the detailed transactions over revenue recognition. We didn't identify any issues. We look at contingent liabilities. We confirm with in-house and external legal counsel to identify any liabilities that need to be accrued and disclosed, and no issues were noted. And then we look at investments in financial instruments. We confirm with the custodian the existence and completeness of those investments. We recalculate the carrying value, the accrued interest, and we test the market value of a sample of investments, and no issues were identified in those areas. The next area is employee future benefits. We put a fair amount of emphasis on this area. We do perform substantive procedures over both the Ottawa Carleton Transit Commission Employees Pension Plan and the City of Ottawa's Superannuation Fund. We look at the liabilities on the non-pension post-retirement and post-employment benefits and WSIB, and we consider the assumptions. We have our internal actuarial specialists look at the valuations and get comfortable with the assumptions used. As a result, we did identify some misstatements, and when we're assessing those misstatements for all of these areas, we really look at the area assessed against our materiality, and then we consider both quantitative and qualitative factors to determine whether we think these would impact a user's decision based on the financial statements. So the areas that were identified here were an understatement of employee future benefits related to indexation of COSF. This is an ongoing error that's been around for a number of years, as well as an understatement of employee future benefits related to some pre-existing plan provisions that had not been included. Those 2 errors are prior period errors, so there's really very little impact on your annual surplus, and so the difference is approximately $23.3 million combined, and it's not considered material to the financial statements. The second area is tangible capital assets. We put a lot of focus here based on the fact that it's a very significant balance on your statement of financial position, and there's a lot of transactions going on. We look at the additions, the disposals, and the amortization of those assets. We do rely on controls over your purchases, payables, and payments, and your amortization in the system. And we do look at agreements around large purchases or construction projects like Ottawa Light Transit and the Arts Corps projects. We did identify some differences here as well. 2 overstatements of tangible capital assets, both related to when depreciation should have taken place in the past. And again, because they're related to prior years, there's really very little impact on your annual surplus in the current year, and we did not feel they were material to the financial statements. Next area is commitments. There were no issues in this area. We just wanted you to be informed that we do focus on this area and the disclosures, and we do perform substantive procedures to make sure it's fully disclosed. Move on to net long-term debt, which was one of the liabilities on your statement of financial position. We do confirm the city's debt. We test the occurrence of debt repayments, and we verify that there's a completeness of the debt principal repayments disclosure, and then we assess against the compliance limits. Based on our work, we did identify that the city is netting the long-term receivable related to light rail transit around with the long-term debt related to the similar project. It's approximately $225 million, and that they are also netting the interest income and interest expense of $5.5 million in the current year. We did note that the terms are identical between these two, between the receivable and the payable, and the city does intend to settle. So the way it's presented represents the substance of the transaction. However, we did identify it as a difference because it is shown net. We don't believe it has a material impact to the users of the financial statements. We do have a slight change to our audit results with respect to this particular item, which was posted on Radar. Our audit is ongoing, as I mentioned, and audit results are drafted until the point in time when they are approved by council. And this is just that the netting is between the long-term receivable and payable, rather than between the long-term debt and the accounts payable line item. And the differences have no impact on the net debt line item, which is the ratio in your statement of financial position, and no impact on your annual surplus. And then the last item is just the other items we look at. There were a couple of other differences that were identified. One related to accounts payable, which was understated, but again, it's a prior year, so it has very minimal impact on your annual surplus. And all other differences that were identified were corrected by management on the financial statements. I'll just note as well, there's one minor change to the financial statements as a result of our ongoing procedures. It's the interest payable information that's included in Note 11C of the financial statements, which is approximately, it states that they're netting the $191 million of interest, and that's not actually the case. There's no netting going on with respect to that, so there's about four words that will be removed from that note because they shouldn't actually be there. So that's the only adjustment that we've identified as a result of our ongoing procedures.
Thank you very much for your report. Any questions on the second, Councillor Wilkinson? None out.
Yeah. Thank you for this. When I'm reading this and even look at your whole report, it looks like you don't have any major concerns with anything that's handling within the way that the reporting of the finances of the city are going.
I think our conclusion is that we believe the financial statements are fairly stated in all material respects in accordance with public sector accounting standards. So.
And the ones that you say are understated or overstated a bit mostly from the past, those have been corrected now so that won't show up in the future, or are they going to be running through?
Some will continue on in the future because the city hasn't actually recorded the amount. So, for example, the indexation on the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund, the city's not recording that liability, and I don't believe they're intending to going forward. So that one, until that indexation no longer exists, when the fund, because that is a legacy pension plan, when that is no longer around, then that will disappear unless the liability is recorded on the financial statements at some point in time.
Somewhere along the line, we also have to let people, when we're talking about a surplus here, it's not a surplus of money that can be used to reduce their taxes. Because it's not that kind of financial auditing. It has all the valuations of things in it. I've found in the past that people get confused by that. Same thing with Hydro Ottawa. They think that we should be paying them back, but they don't realize it's not quite that way because the way statements are done.
Yeah, it's on an accrual basis. It's not a cash basis. Yeah. It's not the same basis as the budget.
But the average person doesn't know that. So I just think when we put the things out, we should let people know that for sure, because we do, every time it's published, we get those questions. At least I do. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. Vice Chair Cloutier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chair Hubley. If Councillor El-Chantier can ask the same question every year, I can ask the same question every year. As a result of your work, was there any change in your audit emphasis that you had elaborated at the beginning of your engagement? Any other issues that came forward that caused you to change your emphasis or your procedures, or that might impact your engagement in the future?
No, I can say that we followed our audit plan. We were able to rely on the controls we expected to rely on, which was good. The controls were found to be effective in all areas where we tested, and our areas of audit emphasis are in line with what we would have said at the audit plan timing.
Any other elements of risk for the city, for the financial recording and reporting of the city that you see in the future?
I think the city is always entering into some fairly complex agreements, and so that's where we see our areas of audit emphasis, understanding those new transactions, how phase 2 gets penned and what impact that may have on financial statements. So I would say that's where we focus our primary audit efforts. Primary audit efforts are around those areas where you've got complex transactions, potentially public-private partnerships, et cetera, where even PSAS, so the accounting board, is still looking at accounting standards in those areas, so it's evolving, and so those are the areas where we see risk and we put focus.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Cloutier. No other questions? Okay. Did you want to? No? You're good? Okay. Thank you both for your presentations. Appreciate it. So is this item carried? And before you answer, please note that the changes will be identified by way of a motion for consideration at the council meeting of June 27th. So motion carried? Thank you. Okay, now moving on to the Office of the Auditor General report on audit follow-ups and related reports. The Audit Committee will recommend to Council that we receive the report of the audit follow-ups, detailed audit follow-up reports, receive and approve the recommendations and review of the source-separated organics program business case, and finally receive and approve the recommendations and the follow-up to the 2011 audit of contract management practices, Spring Hill landfill site contract, and additional 2018 audit procedures. Welcome, Auditor General Hughes, and please proceed whenever you're ready with your presentation.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, membres du comité, conseillers et conseillères. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Audit Committee, and councillors. Je suis ici avec tous les employés du bureau de le vérificateur général. À mon gauche, adjoint administratif pour m'assister avec la présentation, Inès Santoro, et les deux vérificateurs généraux adjoints, Sonia Brandon et Louise Proux, et Ed Miner, et les autres employés de le bureau sont en arrière de nous. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've come with all of the staff of the office who have worked on these projects, and I'm sitting here with the Deputy Auditors, Auditor Generals, who will also help me with the presentation. Dans le processus de vérification, le Bureau de vérificateur général respecte les pratiques exemplaires. The Auditor General, in conducting our audits, follows best practices, and we follow the best practices of the Institute of Internal Auditors and our own City of Ottawa audit standards. On peut voir sur le texte souligné les normes principales de l'Institut de vérificateur interne, et il dit que les vérificateurs doivent instituer un processus de suivi afin de surveiller et d'assurer que les mesures adoptées par la direction ont été mises en œuvre efficacement. Et les processus de vérification par la Ville d'Ottawa sont approuvés par le Conseil en juin 2012. The Institute of Internal Auditors is one of the governing bodies that guides the activities of auditors worldwide. You'll see in the bold text here, we've got a little extract from the audit standards. They indicate that auditors must establish a follow-up process to monitor and ensure that management actions have been effectively implemented. And our job is to ensure that the changes that were recommended and accepted by management and approved by council were implemented. The procedures, the audit procedures and standards of the City of Ottawa were approved by council in June of 2012. And in this next slide, I draw your attention to the highlighted text where it indicates that the Auditor General shall establish such protocols and procedures that are necessary for the conduct of such audits consistent with the City of Ottawa audit standards. And a reminder that once again, those audit standards approved by Council are based on the audit standards developed by the Institute of Internal Auditors. Le processus de vérification comporte 4 phases. Nous sommes ici pour la phase de suivi, qui est la dernière phase dans le processus de vérification. The audit committee will remember that the audit process has 4 phases. The initial phase, where we identify the risks in the area that we're going to be looking at, is the planning phase. The second phase is the fieldwork phase, and that's where we actually do all of the work and gather all of the evidence that we use to prepare the reports, which leads us to the third phase, which is the reporting phase, where we debrief the management in the area under audit, and we prepare a report, which is eventually brought back to the audit committee in our annual report, generally in November of each year. And finally, the follow-up phase, and that's why we're here today. We conduct follow-ups on all audits about 2 to 3 years after our audits are completed. And we do that because we're giving management ample time to implement the recommendations that come out of the audit reports. I want the audit committee to remember that there's a contract that's developed through this process. We provide a report to the audit committee. Management agrees with those recommendations. The audit committee then sends these reports to council where they are approved, and at that point there's a contract between management and council to make good on the recommendations that come out of the audit reports. Les raisons pour les vérifications sont d'améliorer les pratiques de gestion, mais le suivi de vérification permet de faire le point sur le progrès accompli par la direction. Audits themselves are meant to improve management practices and identify possible economies. The follow-up, however, really identifies management's progress on the resolution to the problems that were identified in the audit reports. Now, today we're providing an overview, and in the documentation that we've provided, there's a high-level executive summary on the audits. And should any member of council wish to have a more detailed discussion of a specific follow-up or specific audit, certainly we are available to provide that. Aujourd'hui, nous avons 11 suivis de vérification. Today, we've got 11 audit follow-ups. But there's one thing that's a little different about this year, and I draw your attention to the last item, and that is that in addition to providing a follow-up to the 2011 audit of contract management at the Spring Hill landfill site, we also performed additional audit procedures, and we'll talk to you about that later. I can confirm that management continues to be committed to the audit process, and that they have generally addressed issues raised by our audits. Cette diapositive indique les résultats de suivi de vérification. Et le Bureau de vérificateur général a évalué l'application des recommandations dans 6 catégories. Et je peux dire que, on peut voir sur le diapositive que 68% ou 75 sur 110 des recommandations sont appliquées dans les suivis inclus. We assess the results of our follow-ups with 6 categories, and the categories range from complete, which is obviously what everyone wishes to see, through to partially complete, not started. In some instances, we're not able to make an assessment at all, and sometimes because of changes, the recommendations are no longer applicable, and in other cases, we identify issues that we will add to a future audit. So, Mr. Chair, as we turn to the specific follow-ups themselves, I can tell you that these first 4 audits demonstrated good progress. 35 of the 44 recommendations were fully implemented, and we have no specific comments to make on those audits. I'd like to turn it over now to Deputy Auditor General Ed Miner, who will begin with the follow-up on infrastructure services.
Thank you. We followed up on 4 audits and 1 independent review that were all related in that they dealt primarily with infrastructure services branch. Formerly, used to be a department, so it used to be ISD, so it's either ISB or ISD. I want to point out that the independent review of the Airport Parkway pedestrian and cycling bridge was not conducted by the OAG. However, in 2014, FEDCO asked us to follow up on the recommendations that were made in that report. All told, there were 49 recommendations made related to ISD, and in the 4 audits and the one review, and we found that 31 of these, or 63%, were fully implemented. We also assessed 17 recommendations, or 35%, as being partially implemented. Only partially implementing roughly a third of the recommendations could suggest a lack of sufficient attention to these recommendations. However, we want to stress that was not the case here. ISB has brought in a new project management approach, and with that new software to support their project management approach, and we recognize that that's a significant undertaking. The new project management system, which they refer to as Vision, was not yet implemented in March 2018 when we conducted our follow-up. This resulted in a lot of the recommendations being assessed as partially implemented. We needed to see that the system was actually functioning as intended before we could confirm that the recommendations had been fully implemented. Since then, the system has gone online, and we expect that most of the partially completed recommendations will be fully implemented once the Vision system becomes fully operational. I would ask the Chair if there are any questions on either the 4 previous follow-ups or any of the ISD-related follow-ups.
Does anybody have any questions on the infrastructure services or the follow-ups? I'll just ask you one question on that. The follow-up to the specific areas, the ISD says that you've reached out to 5 municipalities to see what the prices are that they're paying for asphalt. And what have you seen so far from them? Are we paying more or about the same?
Mr. Chair, I think that's probably best answered by management.
Okay. Alan, it's coming down.
Mr. Chair, we're still in the process of conducting that review, but the information that we've seen to date is basically that the prices that we're getting are competitive with the market.
So how many municipalities have responded so far?
I believe that so far we had 2 that formally responded, and we're still waiting for the responses from 2 or 3. The challenge that we get with reaching out to other municipalities is not, and I think the auditor also faced some of the same challenges, is a lot of municipalities are very reluctant to provide prices because they all go through a competitive pricing environment. So getting information is not that easy. But the information that we've certainly been able to draw from different resources certainly point to the fact that we are getting competitive prices for the material that we're receiving.
I would hope we could get some more, so what I'm going to ask if we can do it as you continue your efforts, would it be possible that the Auditor General's office could reach out to your counterparts in other municipalities and see if they have any of that information that we could work with staff and come up with some sort of a comparison on what we're doing for costs and so on with asphalt?
Mr. Chair, we can certainly do that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Did you want to move on to the next item? Thank you, Ellen.
We followed up on the 10 recommendations that were made in the audit of procurement practices related to source-separated organics contract with World. We found solid progress as we assessed that 9 out of the 10 recommendations had been fully implemented. The committee will recall that in 2014, the committee provided direction to the Auditor General to review management's analysis of the potential changes to the World contract. And committee will also recall that we provided a verbal debriefing on this work to the Environment and Climate Protection Committee roughly 2.5 months ago on March 26th. At that meeting, we promised that our report was to follow. And our written report on this work is included here today. Without getting all the details, our work does support management's decision to recommend the renegotiated World contract. That has not changed. We did want to note that our work assumes that the city will change its green bin program to add the plastic bags and the dog waste when the World facility is ready to accept them. And this is important, that the city has to coordinate its transition to the changes in the program to the modifications at the World facility in order to avoid paying higher processing fees to process what we currently put in the green bin, because the rates are going to change when they're ready to take on the new material, regardless if the city is changing. So we just want to make sure that they make that change. We identified 3 areas for improvement in our review, and making 3 recommendations, and management has agreed with all of them. And I would just ask the chair if there are any questions on either this SSO follow-up or on the work we did on the business case.
Councillor Cadre.
Thank you very much. You said that one condition was not followed as of yet with staff out of the recommendations. Do we know what that condition is that is not followed so far?
Yes, in the original audit, we had asked that they can assess the marginal cost of separating out the leaf and yard waste collection and processing it separately. And that information was not actually included in the business case, and we had expected that to be included in there. The analysis was done, and we reviewed it, and it was not cost efficient based on what we saw to make that change, but we would have expected that information been fully disclosed and brought out in the business case that they brought to council. That was the one item that was not fully implemented.
And was there a recommendation from staff as to why the process didn't go forward with that one recommendation?
Without speaking for too much on staff's behalf, what we got basically was it was so clear that they didn't bother. Basically the collection costs are really what the very significant costs in the process, and that the change in collection costs would more than offset any change in processing. And so in their mind it was so obvious it didn't have to be brought forward. In our view, it should have been brought forward anyway.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Mr. Chair, as time goes on and as the various collection contracts open up, it would be beneficial for staff to continue to address that issue from time to time when they have an opportunity to make to make changes as the various contracts open up in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. Councillor Cloutier.
Thank you, Chair Hubley. I guess this question might be to management. Recommendation number 1 is that the city continually challenge the consultant's statements and assumptions, and we've seen this before. It speaks to contract management, and the response to the recommendation is yes. But can we? What specific steps from management are we doing to make sure that we are challenging those assumptions and ensuring the good administration of our contracts?
Chair, management is following the best practices of contract management now as set out by supply services, so I think that's a good step forward. Also, we do rely on the expertise, in this case, of qualified engineers, and in future we'll keep a more regular oversight, specifically from not just the project manager, and I think the auditor did find that the project manager had a fairly good oversight of the modeling that the consultant was doing, but more of senior management to make sure that we have better oversight of the work that's being done at the project management level.
What it speaks to the work undertaken by Dylan. Can you tell us a little bit more about what their involvement will be, and specifically to this contract, the source separated organics, or is it generally across project management in the city?
Chair, the work from Dylan on this project is completed now. It was an evaluation of tonnages going forward in the future. I will say over that piece, we did do a sensitivity analysis requested by the Auditor General, and that even found that the conclusions that we reached to renegotiate the contract was the right option going forward.
My final comment related to that question is simply I hope that the city receives that recommendation not only for this contract, but generally with consultants, and that we examine, that we challenge to ensure that moving forward on every project we are as efficient and effective as possible.
Yes, Chair, and I think that is the crux of the guidelines as set out by supply management.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cloutier. I just have to make an observation here that this is a follow-up to the audit of the separated organics contract that I think most councillors would agree that original audit generated the most letters and comments from residents in our wards, and it's kudos to the Auditor General and his team for really taking the lid off that garbage can and coming up with a lot of good recommendations, and kudos to Mr. Wiley and Mr. Kanalakis for city staff's effort to bring us to the point where I hope I don't jinx you guys with this comment, but I doubt that this is going to be the leading story on the news tonight. That's how far we've come with this, and I think most people from what I'm hearing in the community really like the recommendations and the way forward that you've worked out leading out of this audit. So I want to thank everybody involved for that. Okay, that said, I got that off my chest. Go ahead.
Nous n'avons pas déposé le rapport sur la vérification menée à l'origine en 2011 en ce qui concerne les pratiques de gestion de contrat pour les échanges Spring Hill en raison d'un arbitrage. The Audit Committee will recall that the original 2011 audit of contract management practices for the Spring Hill landfill was not tabled by the Auditor General because of the arbitration. Given that a considerable amount of time has passed since the original audit, in addition to following up to the 2011 audit recommendations, we performed additional audit procedures in 2017 and 2018 to bring the audit up to date. These procedures included an assessment of whether the city has been effectively and efficiently managing the Spring Hill landfill site agreement to date, and an examination of the financial impact of the environmental contamination, closure, and post-closure costs on the city. I'd now like to turn the mic over to Deputy Auditor General Sonia Brennan.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Committee. I'll start with a quick overview of the timeline. As you can see, it's over 20 years, so there are a number of key points that we wanted to remind, refresh, inform. Then we will discuss I'll review the original audit findings and those recommendations, and then we'll review the current work that we did, the additional audit procedures we did to bring everything up to date. Following that, there will be the in-camera portion where we were unable to discuss the details of the arbitration agreement because of the confidentiality order. So as you know, the Spring Hill landfill is a 100-acre landfill site located within the geographic area of the former township of Osgood. This was a public-private partnership agreement that was entered into by the former township of Osgood and Tomlinson. This was done in 1996, predated amalgamation, which, as you know, took place in 2001. Just to review some key terms of the agreement. This agreement between the two parties was effective until the landfill reaches its capacity. The city can dump all residual waste sourced in the geographic area of the former township of Osgood free of charge. Tomlinson, as the manager, can set dumping fees in its discretion at prevailing rates. They are also responsible for all policy decisions related to daily operations. In 2000, there was an amendment to this agreement. The key aspect of this amendment I want to bring to your attention is that it allowed for an additional financial credit to Tomlinson depending on total tonnage received from municipal collection. The city has received 40% of net profits as a royalty payment. And the other key element of the agreement I want to bring to your attention is a project reserve fund. In the agreement, it states that the fund was to reach a total of $1 million at the end of 30 years. It was funded on an annual schedule and is still being done so by Tomlinson. Subsequently, in 1998, a lease was entered into between the former township of Osgood and Tomlinson, and this allowed Tomlinson to operate a construction and demolition waste recycling facility on the landfill site. The expiry date of the lease is 2018, later this year. The lease had no cost to it, so there was no monies received by the city for this lease. Again, this agreement was also inherited by the City of Ottawa upon amalgamation. The lease essentially outlines the respective rights of each party while the facility is operating. The C&D facility collects, processes, and recycles construction materials. It's a 20-term lease. It can be terminated earlier if the overall agreement is terminated before that time. Any residual waste or unrecyclable material that the facility produces is disposed of in the landfill at no additional cost. And then the final term of the agreement I would like to note is that in that agreement, Tomlinson, the tenant, agrees not to conduct any activity that may constitute damage to the lands or the premises or breach any regulations. Relations between the city and Tomlinson have been difficult since amalgamation. This led to an arbitration process that took place in 2009. The arbitration was completed in 2010. A payment was not agreed upon until 2016, and the city received payment last month. So that was 2 years after the agreement to the fees. Next slide. The original audit found that over the length of the agreement, as I previously noted, there had been numerous disputes with Tomlinson. The city needed more information in order to fully understand the landfill operations and to reconcile its annual royalty payments. The agreement did stipulate that accounting records and this information was to be provided to the city. Select information has been provided by Tomlinson, such as audited financial statements, but a significant number of requirements have not been met over the years. City staff has not been presented with sufficient information to assess the operations and therefore have never been able to determine the adequacy of the royalty payments. The original audit also found that the city needed to be more proactive in contract oversight and monitor Tomlinson's compliance with the management agreement. We found the same issue with respect to contract oversight and our updated work. I would like to note that we did notice an improvement in contract oversight, which began in 2014. 4 recommendations were made in the original report. These were related to acting upon the arbitration outcomes, updating council with information, or improving contract oversight and dispute management. All 4 recommendations were assessed to be partially completed. So as we noted earlier, we performed additional procedures to bring this information up to date to look at the interim period since 2011 in terms of the contract oversight. So we assessed how the city was managing the contract. We also assessed the financial impact of the environmental contamination, which I'll talk about further, as well as the closure and post-closure costs to the city. Next slide. With respect to the areas of governance and contract management that we looked at, we found that there's been a high turnover of staff on this project. In addition, during periods of staff transition, we found there was poor handover of files and information from person to person. In our report, we state that when we requested meeting minutes and copies of notes kept by contract managers for their dealings with Tomlinson during the period of 2010 to 2014, none could be provided. The committee should know that a few days ago, to their credit, management told us that they have found some files from this period. This example demonstrates the importance of ensuring that all files and documentation and information, especially for contract management, that they are adequately handed over when key staff transitions occur. Especially concerning with respect to poor documentation practices and record keeping, and the ability to find the files and ensure that they're handed over and transitioned. This is especially concerning given the environment of when you have years of difficulties and disputes with your partner. I think anyone, certainly in the legal profession and otherwise, would agree that it is far more important in those circumstances than any other that you keep very detailed records of interactions, of requests for information, and whether or not your partner is complying to the agreement. This highlights the importance of ensuring that the city has strong contract management policies and procedures to guide and support management in their work. Difficulties in obtaining information from Tomlinson has been an ongoing theme throughout the life of this arrangement. Despite efforts made by the program coordinator, by finance staff, and numerous city requests for information, they have largely gone unanswered by Tomlinson, or select information would be provided that was insufficient for the type of analysis and assurance that management was trying to obtain. We believe that more senior management involvement and engagement and legal involvement earlier may have compelled Tomlinson to provide the city with the information needed to manage this contract effectively. This was also recommended in the original audit in 2011. Overall, the way the agreement was structured, this gave Tomlinson full control over the day-to-day operations and policy decisions. This led to Tomlinson making decisions about Spring Hill without having to consult the city. Often these decisions benefited Tomlinson-related companies. However, once the landfill capacity is exhausted, the city assumes all these risks and costs of any post-closure activities. We examined royalty payments. Over the last 21 years, the city has received a little over $6 million in royalty payments, about $300,000 a year. When we consider the expenses the city has incurred over this period of time, in our opinion, the costs far exceed the royalty payments. The other element that was very evident for us was the concerns around the costs. So there were chargeable and non-chargeable costs outlined in the agreement that could be deducted to determine net income, which impacts the royalty the city receives. The city has literally never received enough information to determine whether costs that should not be charged were not. This information was just not provided, and that's still an unknown. In 2015, more than 50,000 tons of C&D facility waste was deposited in the landfill for free. And again, this is allowed because of the way the agreement is structured. Although the agreement itself restricts the service area of the landfill to the former township of Osgood, any material that's received by the C&D facility, that regional area is extended to all of Eastern Ontario as well as the Outaouais region. Any of the material that goes through that facility can then be deposited into the landfill. In addition to filling up the landfill at a faster rate than originally anticipated, the city is not receiving any revenue for this waste. It is also interesting to note that 76% of the total materials received at the C&D facility came from Tomlinson companies. When we looked at the fees that were being charged from the years 2015 to 2017, at times these fees were discounted as much as 28 to 38%. And these were the fees that were charged to Tomlinson-related companies as compared to non-related parties. Overall, Tomlinson's related parties are benefiting from disposing of C&D materials at preferential rates while having the Spring Hill landfill accept the residual waste at no charge and thereby having the city share in all the related costs. With respect to insurance, the agreement has a requirement for insurance. The detailed requirements of what the insurance was required to cover and the terms of that insurance are referred to in the agreement under a separate schedule, Schedule E. We were never able to receive a copy of Schedule E. It can't be found. Up until this time, as far as we know, it still cannot be found. So the city is unaware of whether or not, over the course of the agreement, that insurance was purchased by Tomlinson and would have been in compliance with the original agreement. We did request to receive a certificate of insurance from Tomlinson during the course of our audit. There is a section in this that there's a pollution liability. We requested a copy of the policy, but to date we still have not been provided with a copy of the actual insurance policy. Over the course of the agreement, we find that the insurance was not monitored or received in terms of records that the city had requested from Tomlinson. Another point to note in terms of the capacity of the landfill, at the end of 2017, it's approximately 75% filled. There was an unforeseen impact of a 20-ton daily limit, or approximately 62,000 tons a year, which was far beyond the projected original capacity of 7,400 tons per year from the former township of Osgood. This, combined with the operation of the C&D facility, is leading to a fill rate of approximately 7 times that was what was requested for this site. There were significant issues of environmental contamination identified by the Ministry of the Environment of Ontario. They identified significant groundwater and surface water issues. They described it as one of the worst in Eastern Ontario. This environmental contamination is impacting provincially significant wetland that surrounds the landfill. Specifically, leachate impacting groundwater is migrating from the landfill to neighboring properties and interacting with surface water outside of the landfill. The city is the owner of the landfill ECA. It's the environmental compliance approval that's received by the ministry. Was required to come up with a medium to long-term plan for environmental remediation. The city submitted an action plan, which has been accepted in draft and in principle by the ministry, and they are required to come back in August later this year with a more a detailed plan for the ministry to receive and approve. The estimated capital cost for the plan is approximately $7 to $8 million. This does not include any ongoing operating costs, which would extend for a considerable amount of years. That information is being worked on by engineering consultants and will be, as we understand, will be further determined later this year. Tomlinson had proposed, at that time they were not in agreement with the city's plan. They had proposed an alternative plan to implement a purge well system to move the contaminated groundwater away from the wetland and onto surrounding property owned by Tomlinson. They would have then proposed that the city purchase this land from Tomlinson as they own those properties adjacent to the landfill. The city had stated at that time that it did not have an interest in that plan. While the city's plan requires a larger upfront capital cost, future operating costs would be lower, and it's also a better solution for the environment. In contrast, the original proposed plan by Tomlinson requires a smaller upfront capital investment, but requires much higher future operating costs that would be borne entirely by the city once the landfill is closed. Once the city's plan is approved by the ministry later this year, the next step will be to determine who will pay for those costs. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to draw the attention of the Audit Committee to recommendation number 8 from this report. I can tell you that it is not a recommendation that we developed without a lot of thought. It's not a step that we took lightly. The relationship between the contractor and the city, where was so troubled with requests for information going unanswered for many, many years, recommending that the city evaluate under the procurement bylaw whether Tomlinson is a good business partner for this project and for future endeavors. And I assure you that a lot of thought was put into this recommendation because of its seriousness. Now, we understand that within the last 48 hours, there's been some discussions between Tomlinson and the city, and that's important and that's reassuring. Nevertheless, in light of those discussions, we believe the city should move quickly to resolve the problems with this relationship while continuing to consider whether Tomlinson is a good business partner for this project and for future endeavors. Now, to finish, management agreed with all 16 recommendations that were in this report. And before going in camera, I would ask the chair if there's any questions concerning either the Spring Hill follow-up or the additional audit procedures that we conducted.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. We're going to go to the delegations, public delegations, before we go to questions, if that's okay, because there's just one registered. I just would like to follow up on what you just said about recent developments and so on. I think we put on the record here before we get into this that the city, as you outlined in your audit, that the city inherited this agreement for the operation Spring Hill landfill from the former Osgood Township municipal amalgamation. It's also important to note that the city acknowledges the agreement with Tomlinson Waste Management to operate the landfill has not been beneficial to the environment or to our taxpayers. And we know that, as you've touched on here that the city management has worked for years to resolve the differences with Tomlinson through extensive discussions and legal arbitration. In order to improve the working relationship between the two parties and before we tabled the actual audit, I actually spoke to the city manager and the president of the Tomlinson group of companies and asked that they get together on the management of this site with the goal of protecting the taxpayer. And that, I believe, well, let's just say these discussions have been fruitful. Tomlinson has agreed to fully cooperate in addressing the environmental conditions at the landfill, which includes assuming responsibility for remedial work as part of the long-term remedial action plan. Now, while we will now, just before we go into asking these tough the audit and the findings, I also want to acknowledge and thank you, the Auditor General, for your work on this and your team. And I believe it's one of the best audits that has come out of your shop yet, and for the benefit of taxpayers. I think it's also important that we acknowledge the General Manager, Kevin Wiley's efforts, as well as City Manager Steve Kanalakis, for their efforts to resolve this matter in the interest of taxpayers. So thank you. Now, if I could call Bill Toms up, he can come and speak to the audit. And then we'll go into questions.
Is he representing?
No, he's not presenting, he's just got questions.
Mr. Chair, it's a bit to get a grumpy old economist out of his house early in the morning and take OC Transpo to come here. But when I knew that Mr. Hughes was going to be here, I couldn't miss it. And I've really been kind of interested in this Spring Hill issue for a long time. Tried to get information on it, stonewalled at every step by for various reasons, many of them quite legitimate. And I must commend Mr. Hughes for all of his work, his staff's work on this. But if I'm shaking, it's not because I'm nervous. I'm just so shocked to hear all of the details today. It is just really quite amazing. And I have a defibrillator here, so if I drop over on the floor, it's because I'm still so excited about hearing all of these things. I guess I had a lot of questions. But it's really, looking back at this, it has taken a long time. And there was a report issued back in the early days, authored by Moira Winch. And she laid out, she used to work for the town of Osgood, and she laid out practically the nub of all of the problems back at that time. It was crystal clear how bad this was. And then when the city took over, everything kind of went quiet. And now we know that the quietness was caused by the fact that there really wasn't very much good oversight that took place. I was particularly puzzled about some of the numbers, because it seemed to me that if the city had actually been able to act and sell this useless asset, because it had nothing to do with the city's waste management priorities, the city is not involved in C&D, if that asset had been put up for auction and sold, we would have made money. We would have been able to sell the asset for something, okay? And then at least we would have collected some property taxes, municipal property taxes, because we've received nothing from that. I suspect we would be better off had we collected municipal property taxes from a third-party owner. In any case, I don't want to get into the legalities of why we're now going to exclude the public from any information, but it just seems like as if this is a really, really important issue which needs to be given some more airing. I'm also a little bit surprised that all of this is now a lot of the details are not going to be released, And I wondered whether or not this is consistent with the Municipal Freedom of Information Act, that if people actually ask for some things, because it seems like a lot of the details that were in arbitration and under the order that was agreed to, put out by Justice Mativier, that surely that type of information, so long as it was not commercially confidential, should be released to the public, so that now we have a bit more of information than what was already available. So I guess my bottom line is I'm really appreciate that someone has taken this whole matter quite seriously, and I'm glad that the committee is looking at it, but I think more work needs to be done, particularly on issues relating to the environmental liability. If we look at that $1 million fund, it's pretty obvious that the money that has been set aside is nowhere near enough to fix the problem. It seems unreasonable that the city would then end up footing the bill for things that have happened at that site shouldn't have happened. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toms. I think Councillor Wilkinson has a question for you, but I just first want to acknowledge and thank you for acknowledging that this is transparency at its best for the taxpayer and at the worst for the city. These are things that nobody likes to put on the table, but thanks to the Auditor General and the function of the audit, we are very transparent. We show all our warts and here's our problems, but what I tend to focus on, and I hope you will as well, is the recommendations that come out of the audit and the steps that city management has already taken based on this audit to rectify all those issues that you talked about. So, Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, I know Moira Warts very well. So you mentioned her report, which was, I guess, pre-amalgamation? And who was it done for, do you know?
It was, I can actually give you a copy.
I can talk to Moira about it.
Okay. It's called Private and Public Partnerships, and it says, can small municipalities participate? And I was very, very impressed with the quality of what she did. It went and was released in a journal called PCED, and she goes into considerable detail on exactly some of the problems, and I can just hold for a minute.
Does that include this specific project?
Oh, absolutely. It goes into great detail on this particular project, and some of the comments that she made were to the effect, the way in which the relationship developed between Tomlinson and the city.